Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Andrew Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, I'm going to be talking about my Week 14 running back rankings for the 2025 fantasy football season, going over my top 36 running backs. So if you're looking for my thoughts on a specific player, travel down to the description of the video. We have timestamps available there. Thank you very much. Okay, let's go ahead and begin by talking about matchups going into Week 14 based on rushing statistics allowed by each individual defense from weeks 5 through 13, because the efforts of the 11 defenders on the opposite side of the field who are effectively trying to stop our running backs from finding success is certainly important to the overall grand scheme of how much success can be found going into Week 14, the final week of the fantasy football regular season. As you can see, the Bengals, the Bills, the Raiders, the Giants, the Commanders, the Jets are the most advantageous matchup based on rushing yards and rushing touchdowns allowed. As we all know, and I've mentioned before, receiving statistics at the running back position isn't a basis of matchup, but rather the overall tendency of the quarterback to check it down, the running back's receiving ability, and effectively the game script and whether it applies for the running back to find more receiving utilization. Nonetheless, these are some of the more advantageous matchups that I'll be referring back to over the course of today's episode, and some of the more disadvantageous matchups. Before I get into talking about my top 36 running backs, if you have not yet already, of course, subscribe to the channel. I'm making daily fantasy football content in order to help you capture a 2025 fantasy football championship over the course of the next 4 weeks. And of course, by subscribing today, not only do you gain an edge upon your league mates, you help me get one step closer to achieving my goal this season of 100,000 subscribers. Thank you very much for all the support. Final thing I wanted to remind you guys of, if you guys want my Sunday morning rankings every single Sunday sent from my email directly to yours, every single position, including quarterback, running back, wide receiver, tight end, kicker, defense, flex for both half and full PPR. Check out Betr. I'm partnering with them for the entirety of the season, not only to provide plays, but of course, Sunday morning rankings. So sign up today using code Andrew, make that first time deposit minimum of 10, and make a first time play within a real cash play, and you'll get those rankings every single week. Besides the potential rankings, you'll also be able to get a free play as of tonight in regards to SGA going more than 0.5 points and assists, an automatic, and you can go ahead and potentially pair that up with the plays that I'm putting together today. Brandon Ingram, Dante DiVincenzo, and of course Michael Badgley, all these potential options in which you can go ahead and put together. That's my play of the day via the NBA. So for those of you who want to take advantage of the opportunity, use code Andrew today, get that free $10, and make sure you're eligible based on the map to the right side of the screen. Thank you very much for all the support. Okay, let's go ahead and let's begin my top 36 running back conversation with our number one, Achane, who's coming off of 3 consecutive games of 120 plus rushing yards. Again, the level of success he has found of late has been unstoppable. 20 plus rushing attempts in those 3 games. They are a run first offense of late. And what a time for the Miami Dolphins as they have an upcoming matchup against the Jets, the 6th best at the running back position via rushing statistics, allowing 17.24 fantasy points per game since week 5, 4.42 yards per carry on average, recently allowing 2 rushing touchdowns to Cincinnati, New England, Baltimore, and Atlanta to their opposing running backs this most recent week. Of course, Atlanta's backfield combined for 162 rushing yards and 2 rushing touchdowns. And hey, besides the matchup being an advantageous one this week, back in week 4 when these two teams took each other on, Achane went for 99 rushing yards and a touchdown. We're just hoping that he can reach those levels of upside where maybe he ends up with 2 touchdowns in this giving matchup as well. Moving on to our number 2 and our number 3, we have Jonathan Taylor and Jahmyr Gibbs, who, as of right now, I'm just going to pair them up because, quite frankly, they deserve to be in this S tier primarily because there are very few running backs in fantasy football that on any given week can show up and put up 30 plus fantasy points. But Jonathan Taylor and Jahmyr Gibbs have done that more than any other running back thus far this season. Therefore, they're going to continue to maintain within this S tier as Christian McCaffrey is taking the week off via bye. But nonetheless, when we're talking about Jahmyr Gibbs this week against Dallas on Thursday night, this is expected to be the highest implicated scoring game of the week. And Jonathan Taylor, even though as of late, it's been 3 weeks since he has had a 30-point performance, it's time to bounce back and get on fire before we get into the fantasy playoffs. What a great opportunity to take on the Jacksonville Jaguars and impose their will on the ground. All right, let's move on to the next tier. We have Bijan Robinson, who takes on the Seattle Seahawks, allowing just 9.4 fantasy points per game, one of the toughest matchups at the position, and 3.66 yards per carry on average to opposing running backs as of late. But last season against this defense, Bijan Robinson was able to find success with Kirk Cousins under center. Early on in that year, he ran for over 100 yards and a rushing touchdown in the matchup. Obviously, we're not anticipating Bijan Robinson to show himself to be what he was last week, this upcoming week as they take on Seattle, as he's coming off of a game of 193 total yards and a touchdown. It's very unlikely that he's going to be able to reach that level of success. But if in fact he can find success early, find a potential early rushing touchdown, or if they can stay competitive early on until, of course, the Seattle Seahawks fully take over, if in fact we're able to do so, the receiving utilization of Bijan Robinson in the second half should be able to continue to maintain him as a top 5 running back prospect. Number 5, we have James Cook. Look, he did all of his damage with both of his starting offensive tackles out last week. Had 144 rushing yards, 33 receiving yards, and no touchdowns. And as of late, he's been able to total 100 plus yards in 5 of the last 6 games and 3 plus receptions in 4 straight games. Yet again, the touchdowns have been missing, primarily because in the last 6 games, James Cook only has 3 rushing touchdowns in comparison to Josh Allen's 8 rushing touchdowns. Josh Allen's going to continue to vulture, but regardless of that fact, they are taking on the number 2 matchup at the position. 19 plus fantasy points per game on the ground, 5.44 yards per carry on average, recently giving up over 200 yards to Chicago, 100 to Pittsburgh, 96 and 2 touchdowns to Baltimore this most recent week. Expect for James Cook to find a lot of success in the advantageous position. Number 6, speaking of Baltimore scoring 2 touchdowns last week, even though both were not attributed to Derrick Henry, we had a little bit of Keaton Mitchell last week finding the end zone. Derrick Henry's been able to find himself in the end zone 1 time minimum in 5 of the last 8 games, and in the last 5 games has had himself 3 plus 100-yard games, but every single one of those games also consisting of 80 plus total yards. The consistency is there while Lamar Jackson is struggling, and since week 6, we have seen Derrick Henry rank as the number 8 overall running back in terms of fantasy points per game on average, and number 9 overall in terms of total fantasy points amongst running backs. Now they have an opportunity of taking on a division rival who just gave up 211 rushing yards to Buffalo. Expect for Derrick Henry and this offense to run through this Pittsburgh Steelers defense that continues to find struggles on a weekly basis. It's not only Buffalo that found success on the ground. The Chargers 96 and a touchdown, Cincinnati 106 on the ground. Many of backfields finding success against the Steelers. Number 7, we have the thumbnail of today's episode. It's Bucky Irving taking on the New Orleans Saints, a division rival matchup. This most recent week, we all thought that Bucky Irving may see a limited utilization considering what the coaching staff was saying, but he comes out and he gets 19 touches off the rip, 81 total yards, and finds himself his first rushing touchdown of the season. It's official that he's back, and as long as Baker continues to struggle within the passing game, they're going to continue to commit to the run game, especially against the Saints, the 12th best matchup at the position, allowing over 16.2 fantasy points per game and 4.32 yards per carry on average. Recently, Miami just ran for 160 and a touchdown against them. Atlanta 114, Carolina 67 and a touchdown, the LA Rams 172 and a touchdown, and Tampa Bay earlier this season in the absence of Bucky Irving, 88 and a rushing touchdown against New Orleans. Expect for a lot of success from Bucky Irving this week as the clear and away RB1 of this offense. Moving on to Josh Jacobs to close out the A tier. Look, this most recent week came away with 0 rushing touchdowns. That's the first time in quite a while. And over the course of the last 19 healthy games he has played, 17 of those games now consist of 1 touchdown minimum. So hopefully going into this week, he's going to get back into the overall rushing touchdown column within his scoreline. And even though, again, he's coming off of this knee injury, he did look good in this most recent game against the Detroit Lions. It's a very positive potential in which he finds himself in the end zone and continues to put up his 15-plus fantasy points as he typically does taking on the Bears. We're hoping for a high-scoring matchup, but recently of late, the Bears have struggled in terms of stopping the run themselves. Pittsburgh 160 and a touchdown, Minnesota 135 and a touchdown, New York Giants 91. Outside of Philly this most recent week, which of course Saquon can't find any success, they have been a turnstile as a defense in terms of stopping the run. Number 9, we have Kyren Williams. Speaking of scoring 15 points and keeping it moving, Kyren Williams has typically been that. Obviously, he's coming off this most recent game in which he tweaked his ankle a little bit, but over the course of the last 24 hours, it has been considered to not be a serious injury, so that we don't have to go ahead and rush to the waiver wires to pick up Corum. But if you are a Kyren Williams manager, should already be on roster in order to have the insurance there. Nonetheless, even in a week in which Kyren Williams had a rushing touchdown stolen by Corum, and additionally had a 4 and 7 yard receiving touchdown from Davante Adams, we still found Kyren in the end zone, which is very much so promising, especially as we approach the 8th best matchup at the position, the Arizona Cardinals, allowing over 17 fantasy points per game on the ground, 4.72 yards per carry on average. This defense has been absolutely torched of late. Seattle 181, San Francisco 105, Jacksonville 105. The expectation is that the LA Rams should be able to impose their will, coming off of a very disappointing performance against Carolina. Then we have our number 10. We have Chase Brown, who as of late has been unstoppable, 6 consecutive games of 100 plus total yards. And it's no surprise with Joe Burrow back in the lineup, we see Chase Brown come away with 7 targets and 7 receptions. That should be the overall baseline of production we see consistently for the remainder of the season. And now that you add T. Higgins back into the overall mix, this offense is going to continue to grow. This is implicated to be one of the highest scoring games of the week. Expect for a lot of potential scoring. And of course, hopefully, Chase Brown finding the end zone against the number 1 running back matchup. Again, we're talking about a defense that's allowing 19.74 fantasy points per game on the ground, nearly 5 yards per carry on the ground. So expect for Chase Brown to be an absolute smash play this week. Number 11, we have Breece Hall, who's putting together some great performances considering Tyrod Taylor is making this team competitive. Justin Fields was not able to keep them in games. This most recent week against the Atlanta Falcons, yes, they were down late in the game, but early on still got a lot of opportunity in the direction of Breece Hall, and now they have an opportunity of taking on Miami, who's allowing 14.6 fantasy points per game on the ground to opposing running backs, 4.77 yards per carry on average, and recently, earlier this season, in week 4 against Miami, we saw Breece Hall come away with 13.6 fantasy points, a total of 110 overall yards, 5 receptions. If this elite level of opportunity continues to be contributed to Breece Hall, expect him to absolutely be a top 12 option by the end of this upcoming Miami Dolphins matchup. Number 12, we have Javonte Williams. Look, the reality of the situation is, if in fact they're going to maintain a positive game script taking on the Detroit Lions, this could lead to even more rushing attempts, which effectively is more yards, and hopefully a rushing touchdown. This most recent week, of course, was bailed out with a receiving touchdown, but nonetheless, we are hoping the rushing category continues to grow for the likes of a Javonte Williams. This game is currently implicated to be the highest scoring of the week, currently sitting at 54.5 total points. The Lions aren't a potential easy matchup by any means, but they've given up their fair share of yards to opposing running backs of late. Green Bay 97, New York Giants 109, Philly 117, Washington 71 and a touchdown, Minnesota 114. So there's a lot of potential for yardage. We just have to hope that Javonte Williams scores a touchdown to get into that top 12 conversation. Moving on to our number 13, we have Travis Etienne, who unfortunately in this most recent game got goal line touches vultured from him by Bijan Robinson, despite how ineffective Bijan Robinson has been, and despite the fact that they blew out the Tennessee Titans. You would have thought that Travis Etienne would have came away with more opportunity, but the fact of the matter is they had to pull the starters, didn't get much utilization late in the game, and when you win 25-3, you would assume Etienne could put up more than 10 fantasy points, but that unfortunately was not the case. But he's been incredibly consistent of late. And this week taking on the Colts, a defense that's given up 141 and 2 touchdowns to Atlanta, 117 in the touchdown to Kansas City, and 98 in a rushing touchdown to Houston. This is a defense that has struggled as of late in terms of stopping the run with the absence of DeForest Buckner. And if that's going to continue to be the case, expect for Travis Etienne to expose that this week. Then we have Quinshon Judkins, who has an incredibly advantageous matchup taking on the Tennessee Titans. And in this most recent week, in the first 2.5 quarters of play, Quinshon Judkins was able to handle 19 of his total 23 rushing attempts because the game was at halftime 10-8. So when you're able to keep it close and Dylan Sampson goes down with an injury and you're able to get 3 targets, 3 receptions, and 18 receiving yards, of course, you're incredibly fantasy relevant. And when you're taking on a matchup that's allowing over 15.5 fantasy points per game on the ground, 4.46 yards per carry on average, recently giving up a touchdown to an opposing running back in each of the last 2 games, you would assume Quinshon Judkins in a matchup at home as favorites can fall into the end zone this week and be a top 15 option. Speaking of number 15, we have RJ Harvey of the Denver Broncos, who is coming off of one of the most bailout performances I have ever seen. 19.7 fantasy points, sure, I expected him to play well, but I did not expect him to be as highly inefficient as he has been. 13 carries for 35 yards is not going to cut it, but over the course of the last 4 games, he's only averaging 2.63 yards per carry and 1.4 yards after contact per attempt. Are we cooked? I don't know, but there's a chance for that to be the case. In the event in which he doesn't find the end zone, we could be in trouble, but this week, luckily, they take on the Raiders, the 3rd best matchup at the position, allowing 18 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs, recently allowing 170 and 2 touchdowns to the Chargers, 67 and 2 touchdowns to Cleveland, 113 to Dallas, and of course, earlier on this season against Denver. In that Thursday night matchup, Denver's running backs accumulated 86 rushing yards. We're hoping for a lot more damage and hopefully the end zone for RJ Harvey. Saquon Barkley is our number 16. Again, this is 3 consecutive games of less than 10 fantasy points where I have to continue to rank him as low as 16. I don't like to do it, but the reality of the situation is he has just not been the Saquon Barkley of old. Now, what a great time to potentially bounce back than against the Los Angeles Chargers. Effectively, they are the 7th best matchup at the position. This most recent week, of course, Las Vegas couldn't do much, only putting up 37 rushing yards, but that's primarily because of game script. Otherwise, the week prior, Jacksonville ran for 183, primarily because of game script. Otherwise, I think Saquon Barkley, if he can come away with 10 fantasy points, we'd be happy with it. But this is the matchup in which in any given week, a running back can run for over 100 and a touchdown against the Chargers, as they are one of the weakest run-stopping defenses in the league. It's just a matter of can Saquon wake up and finally accomplish that. Number 17, we have Ashton Jeanty, who earlier this season, back in Week 10 against Las Vegas, had 13.8 fantasy points, 19 carries on the ground, 60 rushing yards, and a rushing touchdown. Was able to do a lot of damage because the game was close. In the event in which the game gets a little bit separated and the Denver Broncos claim an early lead, the reality of the situation is for 3 consecutive games here, Ashton Jeanty has had himself a minimum of 8 targets or 6 or more receptions in every single game. Therefore, I'm expecting Ashton Jeanty to be fantasy relevant regardless of whether this script goes in a positive or negative direction. And additionally, on top of that, if it's a full PPR coming off of 3 straight games of 6+ receptions, you would assume that he's a far more valuable asset in that overall scoring format, and I would rank him significantly higher in comparison to where I have him in a half PPR scoring format. But hopefully, the Raiders can stay competitive and keep this very exciting this week. Moving on to our number 18, we have Jaylen Warren. Look, he continues to trot along with his 10+ fantasy points per game on a weekly basis, and if he continues to find the end zone and given ample opportunity, he's going to be great. And as long as Lamar continues to struggle on the other side of the ball, taking on the Ravens this week, it could lead to even more rushing opportunity for the likes of Jaylen Warren. But the reality of the situation is, it's purely going to be dependent on the Ravens. The Ravens have scored 10 first half points in the last 2 weeks. In the event in which they keep it close, and it allows for Jaylen Warren to be relevant early on, in this most recent week against Buffalo, once they got blown out, they shifted away from giving opportunities to Jaylen Warren, and because of that, his value diminished completely. So we just have to hope that Jaylen Warren can get his prior to Lamar waking up finally. Moving on to our number 19, we have Bam Knight. This is 100% in the contingency of Trey Benson once again missing this week. Obviously, he didn't practice last week, Thursday and Friday. There is a chance in which Trey Benson does in fact return. If he does, he will take the spot here at number 19 for Bam Knight, or I'll potentially lower his ranking in case he does end up splitting touches with Knight in the upcoming game. But in the event in which Trey Benson is out, remember that Bam Knight has had 12.5, 11.2, and 15.3 fantasy points scored in the last 3 games and a half PPR. He has been a machine, he's been a top 20 option, and will continue to be so this week in the event in which Trey Benson is out. Then we have our number 20, DeAndre Swift, who again is back to his regular scheduled programming. 18+ touches in 3 of the last 4 games. Outside of the 1 game in which he fumbled early and disappeared, he has been incredibly consistent in terms of volume of opportunity, coming off of an incredible game of 10 rushes of 5+ yards. And considering Ben Johnson's familiarity with the Packers as the former offensive coordinator of the Detroit Lions, as long as this team continues to run their outside zone, expect for the Packers, who have given up 100 rushing yards and a touchdown to Detroit, 83 to Minnesota, 128 and 2 touchdowns to the Giants, and 147 and 2 touchdowns to Carolina. They have struggled over the course of the last 5 weeks against opposing running backs. Expect for Swift, but not only Swift, but also Kyle Monangai to find success, as Kyle Monangai is coming off of a great game himself. 11 rushes of 5+ yards, has had himself 1 rushing touchdown minimum in each of the last 4 games. This two-headed monster is set in, and like I mentioned earlier, as long as they want to continue to run the ball heavily, and as long as Ben Johnson continues his familiarity with this Green Bay Packers defense, as he's taken them on year over year over the course of the last couple seasons, expect for this defense that has struggled to stop the run over the course of the last 5 weeks against Carolina, the Giants, the Minnesota Vikings, the Detroit Lions, who have all put up a great number against them. Expect for both DeAndre Swift and Kyle Monangai for another consecutive week to be fantasy relevant. Then we have our number 22, Zach Charbonnet, who again is coming off of his own streak of touchdowns. He has scored 1 rushing touchdown in 3 of the last 4 games, and the only game in which he didn't score a touchdown in the last 4 is when, of course, Kenneth Walker found the end zone against the LA Rams. But this week, they take on the 9th best matchup at the position, 16.5 fantasy points per game, 4.53 yards per carry on average. Again, this defense has struggled against the Jets, the Colts, the New England Patriots, the Carolina Panthers, on the ground, through the air. It doesn't matter. Atlanta's defense is going to get absolutely burnt through by Charbonnet, but also Kenneth Walker, who, even though he is not finding the end zone as consistently as Zach Charbonnet, the overall yardage, whether it's on the ground and through the air, certainly helps him to be a top 24 relevant back, because in any given matchup he can find the end zone, but also his yardage and reception counts alone continue to make him a pretty much 9 to 11 point fantasy producing option. In the event in which he scores a touchdown, we're lucky. Otherwise, still very much so relevant on a weekly basis in advantageous matchups as this team takes early leads and runs the ball late. Then we move on to our number 24, Kareem Hunt. Again, even in the return of Isaiah Pacheco, we did see Hunt be the go-to running back, and he should continue to be as such going into this week. Last season against the Houston Texans, they took them on twice. Once in the regular season, one in the postseason. In both those games, Kareem Hunt went for 11+ fantasy points, finding the end zone in both matchups. And in this most recent week, unfortunately against Dallas, was not able to find the end zone. But more often than not, about 75+% of the time, we're seeing Kareem Hunt find the end zone within this offense when given 10+ touches. So expect for this week for a potential touchdown here against the Texans. Moving on to our number 25, we have Omarion Hampton, who takes on the Philadelphia Eagles. After not returning last week, the expectation, based on the reports, is that he should return on Monday to play against the Philadelphia Eagles, who just allowed 250 rushing yards to the Bears' rushing attack. In the event in which Justin Herbert is healthy, ready to go for the Monday night matchup, Omarion Hampton's back in the lineup. We're hoping that he is going to have as much success as Bucky Irving had in his return, but again, we want to be cautious considering how much of a stud Kimani Vidal was in this most recent game. And if in fact Omarion Hampton has a setback, of course we might look to alternative options because again, he plays on Monday night, and unless you have Kimani Vidal, it may be a sketchy approach in the event in which we get to Monday and then he's a surprise inactive in that circumstance. Number 26, we have Aaron Jones. Look, he's dealing with an AC shoulder injury. That has been something that has plagued him for the last couple weeks here. He re-aggravated it, but the injury is not considered to be serious as he is currently designated as day-to-day. It is crazy to say, but J.J. McCarthy, hopefully returning from the concussion protocol, will certainly help this offense in comparison to where they were this most recent week against Seattle with 4 interceptions thrown by Brosmer. Again, they take on the Washington Commanders. We're hoping for this game to be a competitive one as this is the 5th best matchup at the position. 5.05 yards per carry on average, 17.5 fantasy points per game. Detroit 217 and 2 touchdowns. Miami 169 and a touchdown. Denver 59 and 2 touchdowns. Hopefully, Aaron Jones can be healthy, but not only that, find the end zone, even with J.J. McCarthy doing everything he can to stop this offense from scoring. Moving on to Chris Rodriguez Jr. in the same matchup. Of course, we have the Minnesota Vikings defense, who are in advantageous matchup themselves. 15.86 fantasy points per game since week 5. Seattle 114 and a touchdown. Green Bay 128, 2 touchdowns. Chicago 111 and a touchdown. Baltimore 107 and a touchdown. That's 4 straight weeks of allowing over 100 rushing yards and 1 rushing touchdown. Under the assumption that Chris Rodriguez is given the ample opportunity as a running back who has scored 1 rushing touchdown minimum in 4 of the last 6 games, he could very easily outproduce the number 27 overall spot, just waiting to see the overall designation of Jaden Daniels return. Number 28, we have Devin Neal. Look, 17 touches in the first game as a starter of this offense is absolutely promising. And with Taysom Hill getting very little opportunity share within the rushing category, it does give me more confidence for Devin Neal going into the matchup against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, who are allowing 4.99 yards per carry on average to opposing running backs and 13.41 fantasy points per game. Just need a lucky touchdown. Otherwise, the opportunity, the yardage is already there. Just find a touchdown and he's easily going to be a top 15 running back by the end of the week. Then we move on to Woody Marks, who is in the exact same position. He's coming off of 16, 19, 17, and 20 touches in the last 4 games. The only thing that has been absent from his scorelines is purely either more receptions or more touchdowns. And unfortunately, Nick Chubb yoinked one this most recent week because Woody Marks was dealing with a bit of an injury over the course of that game, but still returned to get the bulk majority of touches. He's the starter. Just need to find the end zone against Kansas City to be fantasy relevant anywhere beyond the number 29 rank or within this F tier. Moving on to our number 30, speaking of finding the end zone, we need David Montgomery to find the end zone once again every single week. It's really just not the 2024-2023 season. We are unfortunately in a purgatory in which David Montgomery is getting lucky to find the end zone and very lucky to find a consistent volume of touches, which has not been the case of late. They're taking on the Cowboys. They're allowing 5.17 yards per carry on average since week 5, but since they have added Quinshon Williams, they've allowed only 74 rushing yards to Kansas City, 30 to Philly, and 13 to the Las Vegas Raiders. As of late, Quinshon Williams really has turned around this defense, so I'm a little bit worried about what David Montgomery could present within the upcoming matchup. Then we have our number 31. Of course, it's Tyler Allgeier, who as of this moment, again, very much so touchdown dependent like a David Montgomery, but at least as of late has scored consistently 1 rushing touchdown in 3 of the last 4 games. He's pretty much in the same kind of realm as a Zach Charbonnet. He just doesn't get as much rushing workload over the course of a game in terms of the yardage. They're taking on Seattle, a tough matchup. He's a start if you're in a desperate position considering the bye weeks and injuries that continue to plague us. Then our number 32 is Kenneth Gainwell. Look, the reality of the situation is if the Baltimore Ravens take an early lead, it'll lead to hopefully more receiving utilization for Kenneth Gainwell. Obviously, Aaron Rodgers is not as keen to check down the ball in the direction of his running backs as Mason Rudolph was in these most recent weeks. But in the event in which this game can stay close, Kenneth Gainwell can get his opportunities on the ground through the air, can very easily be a top 30 option, considering the level of production he has found in the most recent games. Then we have our number 33, Tony Pollard. Look, the reality of the situation is they're only 3.5-point underdogs on the road in Cleveland. He's had 10-plus rushing attempts in all but 1 game this season. And if, in fact, this is going to be a game in which it's heavy weather implicated, heavy run for both sides, hopefully Tony Pollard can go ahead and rack up his yards and then effectively just find the end zone once in the most recent weeks, which would be great against Cleveland. Moving on to Michael Carter at number 34, a far more relevant option in a full PPR, but as long as Trey Benson is out, Michael Carter continues to be fantasy relevant on a weekly basis considering his receiving workload. Again, far more valuable in a full PPR league, but still as late been very much so relevant and can very easily score a touchdown in any given circumstance. Then we move on to number 35, Kimani Vidal. He went absolutely nuclear in this most recent game with 137 total yards, a rushing touchdown, 20 fantasy points. But with Omarion Hampton expected to return on Monday, this could end up being a 1-2 combo where Vidal is just as valuable as a Montgomery or Allgeier. But considering we haven't seen the combination of the two run within this backfield within a single game, it's tough to say exactly how they're going to distribute and disperse the overall opportunities going into this week. Then we close out today's episode with Jordan Mason. In the event in which Aaron Jones' shoulder injury is a far more serious situation that they have let on, then of course there's a lot of value taking on the 5th best matchup at the running back position. 5.05 yards per carry on average, 17.5 fantasy points per game, allowing a rushing touchdown minimum in each of the last 3 games against Denver, Miami, and Detroit, who have all found success as backfields. Therefore, Jordan Mason, in the absence of Aaron Jones, could be a value, but if the Minnesota Vikings commit to a run-heavy approach, they could also find themselves with both their running backs being fantasy relevant, just in the same way in which, of course, Seattle and, of course, the Bears continue to do so on a weekly basis. All right, that's going to cover it in regards to my top 36 running back options for Week 14 of the 2025 fantasy football season. Thank you everybody for watching. Final thing I wanted to remind you guys of, if you guys want to support the channel besides the content that I produce here, of course you can find content via asking me questions via the Patreon. Of course, get my rankings every Thursday and Sunday. And of course, join the Patreon only Discord community server. For those of you guys who are interested in all that, there's a link down in the description. Thank you for supporting the channel. I'll be back later tonight starting at 7 p.m. live streaming here on the channel. And until next time, I'll see you guys. Peace.